Debate today, India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh visited Pokhran, the site of India's nuclear tests in 1998 and 1974. To mark the first death anniversary of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, he was Prime Minister when the 1998 tests were conducted. Flanked by Army Chief General Bipin Rawat, here's what Rajnath Singh said.
ये बात सच है कि जहाँ तक हमारी न्यूक्लियर पॉलिसी का सवाल है उसमें नो फर्स्ट यूज कि आज तक हमारी पॉलिसी यही है. अब भविष्य में क्या होगा ये सब परिस्थितियों पर निर्भर करता है.
To make sense, if those words mark a shift in India's nuclear policy, I'm joined by Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, Director of the Society for Policy Studies, Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow at ORF, and Strategic Affairs Expert Colonel Ajai Shukla. Before getting into the merits of what those words could signal as a shift, I'm going to ask each of these leading experts of India's strategic affairs what they read from the minister's words. First, you, Commodore Uday Bhaskar.
Well, I would say that given the event, which is the first death anniversary of Prime Minister Vajpayee, there was a certain political context as also a certain relevance for the BJP as a party. If you read the statement, particularly what has appeared in English, along with the tweets that are now available on social media, my own reading is that, first of all, there is no change as far as India's nuclear posture is concerned, and the commitment to no first use. But what is interesting is the fact that there is an add-on to say that as far as the future is concerned, we would have to review the circumstances. Now, it's a cryptic statement. It lends itself to various kinds of interpretation. But again, there is a context that in Modi 1.0, when Mr. Manohar Parrikar was the defense minister, he also made a similar kind of reference and then quickly added that this was his personal opinion. Now, there are many views in India about the commitment to NFU. For me, as an analyst, I would say that we have a new defense minister in Mr. Rajnath Singh, and I think he is trying to convey that he is cognizant of the nuclear issue, and he has made reference to circumstances. In the event they change, India would perhaps review its own position. So I think that is the kind of subtext of what he has said.
Mr. Joshi, how about you? What did you make of what he said?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Rajnath Singh, as defense minister, is not a key player in nuclear policy. He's a member of the political council of the Nuclear Command Authority, but the chairman of that is the Prime Minister. And I think it's commonly understood that the nuclear button is really in the hands of the Prime Minister, number one. Number two, as far as the Executive Council goes, management of the nuclear capability, that's in the hands of the National Security Advisor. So I think, that Rajnath Singh was basically trying to establish some kind of a connect to something with which he is really not involved in, meaning the nuclear use, etc. He's one of the members of the political council of which the Prime Minister is chairman, and only they can decide nuclear use. So if it's a policy statement, I think it would have normally come out of, let's say, the National Security Advisor, who is the chairman of who chairs the Executive Council, meaning the management of nuclear assets. That's one thing. Number two, there's nothing new in this. Shiv Shankar Menon, in his book Choices, has also referred to this, and he has discussed various options. And he said what the idea that the possibility that we may actually use nuclear weapons and no first use. That is, if we get to know that the adversary is preparing for a strike.
Right.
So there are situations in which no first use will not operate. So I think this is something which has been discussed, which is there in the policymakers are well aware of this. So I don't see that as being particularly unique.
Okay, I'll get to the merits of a shift later. Colonel Shukla, your take on the wording of what he said.
Well, while I agree with Manoj that the nuclear button is not in the hands of the defense minister and Rajnath Singh is not a key player in nuclear sort of conflict decision making, I would say that this is a very, very significant statement, and this is a well thought through statement, given the fact that Rajnath Singh not only said this verbally, but subsequently tweeted this in almost exactly the same words. So it was not a one-off sort of toss-off comment. It was a statement that was made in two different media by a key player in the national security decision making. So I think there was a signal being sent out. The signal that was sent out quite obviously is that India's nuclear doctrine is not unchanging and unquestioning of circumstances, but will change with circumstances. Now, there are two ways one can interpret this. The benign interpretation is that New Delhi is signaling to countries like China and Pakistan that if they change their nuclear doctrine, that's the circumstances change, then India will follow suit as well. And the other interpretation is that India is trying to sort of walk between two different sort of directions, signaling on the one hand a commitment to no first use, but also sowing doubt in the minds of the adversaries whether India would actually adhere to it in a crisis or not. So, we'll have to see what the follow-up statements are and what the follow-up government positions or denials or clarifications that come out. But for now, this is it.
All right. Commander Uday Bhaskar, taking off from what Ajai Shukla just said, and if you may permit that, if the way I read this, because you said that there was no change, the moment the second half of the line says future policy will depend on the circumstances, it means that you're saying right now that a later situation will be judged on its merits. When you say that down the road, you're saying that a situation is open for a binary choice, and you're signaling when NFU is a commitment towards the future, right? It's saying we will not use. That when you say now the words that there is a binary choice that could be open and would be decided down the road, you are already in the current junking no first use. Is that a fair reading?
No, I would not say that this is a case of junking NFU, because if you recall, even when Prime Minister Vajpayee made this particular statement and committed India to the no first use, it was a very, very grave statement, because I do recall that there were a number of discussions at that time saying that is the Prime Minister of India not taking into account the safety of Indian citizens when we have a very, very adversarial and difficult nuclear neighborhood in relation to China, Pakistan, and the kind of cooperation that exists between these two countries when it comes to weapons of mass destruction. I think the subtext, I used this particular phrase earlier, the subtext of deterrence and the Indian posture is that we are committed to no first use, but this is predicated on the credibility of the Indian capability, which in turn sends a signal, and we have differently used words, phrases to suggest that the response in the event India is subjected to such a challenge or a threat would be of an order that in itself strengthens the element of deterrence. So there is, I would say, a certain core of the commitment to NFU, and that it will not be junked the way you have phrased it because of whatever be the current circumstances. I want to pick up two of the points made by both Ajay and Manoj. One is to say that, yes, there is a certain signal. Signaling is inherent to nuclear deterrence. And more recently, even within the Indian security and strategic community, there has been some anxiety about Pakistan taking recourse to tactical nuclear weapons. And there is a whole, I would say, China kind of relevance over here, whether or not China has been contributing, abetting the Pakistani posture. So I would say that it is against this backdrop that there has been a certain amount of signaling about India's intent, India's posture. And you can find elements of this, I think Manoj pointed this out, in Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon's book, the former National Security Advisor. So I think there is all of this, but we are trying to perhaps load Mr. Rajnath Singh's reference to circumstances in this. We should wait for a day or two to see as to what else the government might want to say. But for now, I repeat this point, this does not imply a change in India's commitment to NFU. That is my reading of Mr. Rajnath Singh's statement.
Okay, so I think we're done with the round of trying to parse his words and figure out exactly what he might have meant. Moving on to arguments others have put forth in reaction, there was a tweet from Subramanian Swamy that hints at some part of what some of you referred to, trying to second guess or perhaps preempt what Pakistan might be up to. And he goes on to say that Rajnath Singh is correct to warn about possible review. He says no first use is required because Swamy believes that there is an element of unpredictability in the Pakistan establishment right now. My question on that is this, Manoj Joshi, that if you do that, if you take that as your stance, here's what happens as a consequence, which is that a country that did not commit to this now has a reason to say, well, if India moves from that, here's exactly why we need our finger on the trigger, because earlier at least we knew that India wouldn't, now they might, so let us keep our finger on the trigger.
You know, in nuclear deterrence theory, there's one aspect, first use, certain things happen. If you go on to the first use paradigm, or even a launch on warning paradigm, your kind of nuclear force posture is completely different. In the sense, you then have to be watching everything at all times. Meaning, you've got to have early warning satellite. You've got to have launch, be tracking launch of the other person's missiles. There's a lot of stuff that happens. You've got to spend a huge amount of money if you adopt a first use posture. Now, in the case of Pakistan, it's true that that there is some worry about its behavior, and it has a very well-known first-use posture, but China doesn't. And most recently, China has reiterated its no first-use posture in the white paper that was issued last month. They have reiterated that issue. My point is that if you want to get on to the first-use posture, your entire perspective on nuclear war will change. It will require an expenditure of vast amount of money. And I think the initial scheme that was thought of, that is that the idea of having a posture of assured retaliation, I think makes it safer for the world as such. And also, if you can push, diplomatically, if you can push the other country, let us say Pakistan, because of the three countries here, Pakistan, India, and China, one country doesn't have a no first use posture, and that is Pakistan. And I think diplomatically, it's not unachievable that we could get Pakistan to get into NFU as well. That's safer for everyone. We got to understand that nuclear war simply should never be fought and simply cannot be won by anyone. Meaning it's totally destructive, totally sort of foolish. So my point here is that when we talk casually of these issues, we should think through what the implications are likely to be. And I think so far, the no first use posture has done well for us. It's done well for China. Now, of course, it's true that there are certain developments, for example, hypersonic vehicles, the new kind of ballistic missiles. China is developing a posture with which it wants to be able to deter the United States. Now, if it deters the United States, it may develop capabilities which are overwhelming for us in India. So we may have to relook at certain things. All I can say is that the last time Prime Minister Modi looked at it, and that is just before the election, 2014 election in April, he made a statement. He said, no first use was a great initiative of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. There is no compromise on that. We are very clear. No first use is a reflection of our cultural inheritance. Meaning, I use that word, that is the quote that I have at that time. And Prime Minister Modi, as we all agree, is the key person here. Now, of course, Ajay is right that there could be signaling through the defense minister, and we really need to see how this plays out in the coming days.
Ajay Shukla, let me take this to the context and the circumstances in which some of these commitments were given by the three countries that adopt such a commitment to the rest of the nuclear powers and the rest of the world. India in 1998, at a time when the rest of the world was skeptical of the circumstances in which Pakistan would follow up with tests as it did, and sanctions hit. China in its tests in the middle of the last century, and the fact that North Korea in its tests very recently after its tests has reiterated somewhat of a similar policy. Is it perhaps, to put this as a counterfactual perhaps, that with a 21-year record of being a responsible power, that an explicit commitment to the rest of the world is no longer required?
Oh, well, to begin with, a lot of erosion has taken place in India's nuclear policy as it was enunciated in the aftermath of the nuclear tests in 1998. And then subsequently in the January 2003 nuclear doctrine that was done. Now, Indian strategists are too given to navel gazing. They believe that what they say is more important than what anybody believes. But the simple fact is, Kaushik, neither China nor Pakistan believes in India's no first use declaration. It has been eroded too much along the way. First by Shiv Shankar Menon in his famous speech in 2010, then by statements from Parikar, then by Shiv Shankar Menon's book, then by the BJP's 2014 manifesto itself, which said that it would review nuclear policy, which was widely assumed to be a review of no first use. So the simple fact is that our key adversaries, Pakistan and China, do not believe our new no first use commitment. Along with that, India's investments in the nuclear force posture that Manoj was talking about and that Commodore Uday Bhaskar also mentioned gives the impression that it is not a new no first use state. It has made impressive advances in surveillance and reconnaissance platforms, the hypersonic strike capabilities, conventional nuclear long-range missiles, its ballistic missile defense capabilities. These are all instruments and instrumentalities of a first-use state. So, it's one thing to make a statement. It's another thing to see how much your likely adversaries are believing that statement. And deterrence is a factor of the latter, about how much credibility your statement carries. So I think it's hard enough to convince anyone of a new no first use doctrine, your adversaries I'm talking about. But when you have senior officials like Rajnath Singh and Manohar Parrikar routinely questioning no first use, then it becomes even less credible.
Fair enough. Commodore Uday Bhaskar, in that environment and the way all of you have laid this out, that there is skepticism among the rest of the community about each of the nuclear powers and them continuing with that, the three that do. In such an environment, are there lessons from some of those flashpoints in the Cold War in being in a state of heightened alert about all other countries? The 83 incident of Stanislav Petrov, where a false alarm of sorts had to be studied and a pause was put at the last moment. Just the lessons of the 60s and the 80s of the Soviet-US face-off in a world that views every other nuclear power with skepticism.
Actually, Kaushik, I have a slightly different take on this.
Okay.
As opposed to skepticism that you are referring to, I'd make the following case to say that if you review the history of the Cold War, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the empirical fact is that both the former Soviet Union and the United States had acquired vast quantities of nuclear weapons of frightening level of destructive capability, the apocalyptic capability. But yet, through the 70s and the 80s, the two sides made sure that they were able to generate a certain amount of trust among the professionals. So if you look at all the agreements, which finally peaks in MAD, the mutually assured destruction, both sides had arrived at a political and a strategic assessment about each other's capabilities, as also how the intent would be kept below a certain median. So I would suggest to you that as opposed to skepticism, what was critical in the Cold War was the level of professional trust that the two sides had. It was based on verification, on monitoring each other's capabilities, movements of missiles, etc., etc. But today, in our own context, and I'm talking about Southern Asia, where we have China as the biggest nuclear weapon power, then we have Pakistan and the strategic cooperation between China and Pakistan. Therefore, the Sino-Pak overlap. And what does this mean for India? I would say that within the dyad of India and China, there is a certain implicit acceptance that neither side sees the other as a nuclear threat. There is stability in that dyad. We can't say the same about India and Pakistan. And the gray area is whether China is contributing to Pakistan's stability or tacitly encouraging a revisionist behavior. So I think for India, Mr. Rajnath Singh's statement, I would place it in this context to say that it is in our interest as a country committed to NFU to make the China-India, the Sino-Indian dyad even more robust in terms of the commitment to NFU, encourage the rest of the global community, including Mr. Donald Trump, to revisit the NFU commitment along with the other powers, because as Manoj said, we cannot envision the use of a nuclear weapon by anybody, including a non-state. And I think political responsibility lies in moving in that direction and trying to create a discourse along these lines and bring Pakistan also into this grid to say whatever be your other concerns, whether it is Kashmir, etc., the nuclear issue should be standalone and only go back to what in the jargon used to be called the core mission.
All right.
And we all have to be cognizant of technology, as Ajai Shukla has just pointed out. There are lots of things happening, including R&D in mini nukes. And I think all this has to be kept on the radar. Kaushik?
Manoj Joshi, 15, 17 years ago, when all that came out of the proliferation and the spread of the technology that happened because of AQ Khan, there were worries that not just North Korea or Iran, that there might be non-state actors in which some of this would, in whose hands some of this could come. A decade and a half down, is that a fear that's now been extinguished?
I would say more or less yes.
Okay.
In the sense that, with the taking out of Libya, with the AQ Khan network, now we know that some of the technologies they had already been compromised by the CIA, especially the one that went through the Swiss connection. That technology didn't work, and also some of it that went to Iran. Iran right now, of course, is considered as a proliferation threat in this region, but there is a separate dynamic taking place there, so I won't talk about it. But when it comes to non-state actors, yes, I think it's simply people are now aware of the fact that this so-called dirty bombs, the possibility that some non-state actors can rig up a bomb or something like that. I think most people realize that that's simply not possible.
I'll close this on the signaling domestically, Ajai Shukla, and to compare it to 5th of August, 6th of August and the move on 370. One part of it was how the rest of the world would take it. The other is how citizens in India, and particularly those that find appeal in a strong nationalistic message, is it saying, even if you don't intend to do first use, is this government signaling that we're not letting our hands tied down by commitments to the world anymore?
Well, I think this government is doing what it said it would do in 2014, in its manifesto of 2014, which is to review nuclear policy. And the form of the review, in my opinion, at least based on Mr. Rajnath Singh's statements today, is not a simple abandonment of no first use or a re-embrace of that doctrine. It is more like the creation of an uncertain environment for decision-making by the adversary. It's so that there is a greater degree of uncertainty and imponderables in its decision-making. No first use, in any case, as many strategists have argued, is an untenable doctrine in the India-Pakistan context. In the India-China context, as one of my co-panelists pointed out, it works well. But in the India-Pakistan context, context, it's far less tenable. General Nagal, who's a former strategic forces commander, has pointed out that no Indian prime minister can sort of just hold off any action on the nuclear front when he knows there's a strike coming from the enemy. So in that context, NFU, I think, was a noble and a laudable doctrine that India needed at a certain point in time. But I think this government, whatever its motives, whether domestic political benefits or a more sort of rational, the creation of a more rational nuclear philosophy, I think it's taking the right steps in this particular instance. And I think that creation of a greater degree of uncertainty rather than a clearly enunciated policy is the way to go.
All right. On that note, Ajai Shukla, Manoj Joshi, Uday Bhaskar, thank you very much for making time, for trying to interpret the comments that Defense Minister Rajnath Singh made today and how that lays the road for India's nuclear policy going forward. If you have been, thank you for watching.